The Evercrest Hotel had not heard human footsteps in years. Its corridors were a graveyard of peeling wallpaper, shattered chandeliers, and carpet stiff with mildew. Once it had been the crown jewel of the city's skyline. Lavish parties, wealthy businessmen, whispered affairs behind closed doors. Now in 2005, it was little more than a hollow carcass scheduled for demolition. On a gray morning in March, a demolition crew stepped through the warped double doors. Their boots echoed against the hollow lobby, stirring dust that rose in silver plumes through beams of pale light. The silence carried an almost religious weight, as if the building itself wanted to be left alone. In the east wing, where wallpaper hung like torn skin, a worker's crowbar struck plaster. The wall gave way with a groan, spilling chunks of dust and wood onto the floor. Something tumbled out. A leather bag, scuffed, its once bright surface dulled by time. Airline tags still clung to the handle, faded to near illegibility. The men stared at it, hesitant. A bag sealed in a wall was not normal debris. One of them crouched, brushing the grime with his gloved hand. The initials on the tag, faint but still legible, spelled E. Morales. "Hey, boss," the worker called, voice sharp in the silence. "You'd better see this." The foreman approached, eyes narrowing. He tugged the zipper. It resisted, then gave with a rasping sound, releasing a stale puff of air that carried an odor both metallic and earthy. Inside lay the relics of a vanished life. A folded uniform blouse, brittle with age. A stack of yellowed boarding passes, and a slim wallet. The wallet snapped open easily. There, behind a cloudy plastic sleeve, was a face, a young woman with dark eyes and a neat airline smile, frozen in time. Beneath her photo, the name read, Elena Morales. The foreman felt the weight of the discovery press against his chest. He had heard the name before. Everyone in the city had, though it was little more than a ghost story now. The flight attendant who vanished in '93, walking out of JFK and never seen again. Her case had gone cold within months, swallowed by newer headlines, her family's grief gradually abandoned by public memory. The worker shifted uneasily. "You think this means she was here?" The foreman didn't answer. He knew enough to recognize that this was no ordinary find. A missing woman's belongings sealed inside a hotel wall for 12 years were the kind of thing that pulled ghosts back into daylight. He closed the wallet, his hands trembling despite himself. Around them, the hotel creaked under its own decay, as though listening. The silence broke with the foreman's order. "Call it in now." Outside, the wind pressed against broken windows, carrying faint echoes down the hallways. For 12 years, the Evercrest Hotel had kept its secret. Now, with a single swing of a crowbar, it had spoken, and somewhere, the truth of Elena Morales stirred awake, waiting to be unearthed piece by piece. The discovery at the Evercrest Hotel made the evening news within hours. Archival photographs of Elena Morales flashed on TV screens, her neat hair tucked into a flight attendant's cap, her smile polished yet soft. For a generation too young to remember, her name was new. For those who lived through 1993, it was a wound reopened. Back then, Elena had been 27, a woman who carried the world in her stride. Polished shoes clicking against the polished floors of international airports. Colleagues described her as disciplined, but there was something restless in her eyes, as though the ground never felt steady beneath her. On the morning of March 18, 1993, Elena stepped off a transatlantic flight from Paris into the chaos of JFK. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her frame, but she walked quickly, clutching her handbag to her chest. In her other hand was a single white envelope, folded and refolded until its edges curled. Her roommate, later questioned by police, remembered the phone ringing that afternoon. Elena's voice was tight, nervous. "Don't wait up," she'd said, her usual warmth stripped away. When asked where she was going, she hesitated before adding, "Just out." It was the last time anyone heard her voice. Narration fills the silence that records cannot. The way she left her suitcase half unpacked in the apartment, shoes by the door, a coffee cup still rinsed and drying on the rack. There was no note. No clear sign of intention. Just an ordinary day that ended in vanishing. Her coworkers noticed changes in her weeks before. A distracted look. Tears blinked away quickly in the galley, long silences in crew lounges. She had started carrying notebooks she never let anyone touch. One colleague remembered her staring out of the aircraft window during pre-flight checks, whispering something like a prayer. She looked trapped, the colleague later testified. Like someone waiting for a storm she couldn't stop. The official story was thin. Elena clocked out of work at 5:12 p.m. She was seen exiting Terminal 4 at 5:20, dark coat wrapped around her, the envelope still in her hand. After that, nothing. No taxi logs, no subway footage, no phone calls. She simply stepped off the map. The police opened a missing persons file. Flyers with her photograph papered subway stations and bus stops. For weeks, her family begged for answers. Her mother's trembling plea appeared on local news. Please, if anyone has seen my daughter, let her come home. But the city's attention soon shifted elsewhere. Another crime. Another headline. By summer, the case grew cold. Suspicions flickered. A secret lover, a criminal entanglement, voluntary disappearance. Yet nothing fit the Elena her family knew. She was careful, cautious, dutiful. She had been saving for a down payment on her own apartment. She had even renewed her passport days before. None of it suggested a woman about to erase herself. And still, the envelope she carried that day remained unaccounted for. Its content is unseen. Its purpose is unanswered. The narrative folds back to the present, 2005. The discovery of her bag at the Evercrest is no longer just debris in a ruined hotel. It is a door creaking open. Investigators comb through the old case files, photographs yellowed by time, interviews cut short when hope had dimmed. They begin again with the first question. Who was Elena Morales afraid of? Who waited for her that night? And why had her life ended in silence? The answers, long buried, waited in the shadows of those who once flew beside her. The Evercrest discovery forced detectives to return to old flight logs, piecing together the last hours of Elena Morales' known life. Her final assignment, the Paris to New York flight on March 18, 1993, was now scrutinized in forensic detail. The passenger manifest revealed names that once meant little: businessmen, students, tourists, and politicians. But one name stood out now, a name that carried weight and influence: Richard Halden. Halden in 1993 was already known in financial circles. Wealthy, charismatic, and ruthless in business, he occupied the coveted window seat in first class, seat 2A. Colleagues remembered his ability to dominate a room without raising his voice. Women described him as magnetic, though unsettlingly so, as though his charm was designed to draw you in before it tightened into a snare. Several crew members later admitted, quietly, that Elena had paid unusual attention to Halden on that flight. Not in the professional, neutral way flight attendants often did, but with an intensity, a nervousness almost like recognition. One recalled how her hands trembled slightly when pouring his drink. "Are you all right, Miss Morales?" Halden's voice had been smooth, practiced. He leaned closer, studying her in that predatory way some men did when they sensed fear. "I'm fine," she answered quickly, but her gaze didn't meet his. Passengers nearby noticed the subtle exchange. It was not affection they sensed, but tension. Something unsaid hung between them like static in the cabin. When detectives revisited the records, they learned Halden had stayed in New York that same night, booking a suite at the Evercrest Hotel. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. In 1993, Halden had been interviewed briefly after Elena's disappearance. He had denied knowing her personally. Just another flight attendant, he had shrugged. His lawyers had ensured the interview went no further. With no evidence linking him to her, the lead had evaporated. But now in 2005, with her bag found inside the very hotel where he had stayed that night, the connection flared with new urgency. Investigators dug into Halden's history. His name was tangled in rumors, extramarital affairs, hostile takeovers, employees who left jobs broken, muttering about intimidation. Yet nothing had ever stuck. He had money, lawyers, and friends in high places. People described him with equal parts admiration and fear. The case file revealed something else. In the weeks before her disappearance, Elena had been spotted at upscale restaurants in Manhattan, never with colleagues, never with family. A witness, a maitre d', remembered her once sitting across from a tall man with piercing eyes. Though he couldn't swear under oath, he later told police, "I believe it was Halden." If true, it suggested more than coincidence. It suggested a secret. What haunted detectives most was Elena's demeanor in those final days. Her exhaustion, her guarded silences, her whispered breakdowns among colleagues. If she and Halden were entangled, it was not with romance alone. There was fear there. a fear that seemed to shadow her steps. One line from her unsent notebooks, recovered in her apartment, lingered in the mind of investigators. He says I belong to him, but I don't. I can't. The handwriting trembled on the page as though written in haste. By now, Halden was nearly untouchable. In 2005, his empire had grown, his reputation burnished by philanthropy and public charm. To accuse him was to invite ruin. But the evidence, faint as smoke, pointed again toward him. Still, suspicion without proof is fragile. The bag was a beginning, but it was not a verdict. The detectives knew the next step was to trace Elena's hidden words. The letters never mailed, the fears never confessed. Perhaps in her own handwriting she had already named the man in the window seat, and if so, her silence was no longer protection. It was testimony. The manila box sat untouched in Elena Morales' old apartment for 12 years. It was found not by family, but by detectives revisiting her case after the Evercrest discovery. The box had been wedged into the back of her closet, behind suitcases and winter coats, overlooked during the original search. Inside were fragments of her private world, notebooks filled with hurried handwriting, folded scraps of paper, and most striking of all, letters. None had stamps. None had been mailed. They were drafts, confessions to no one and to everyone. The first began formally. To whoever finds this, if I cannot speak for myself, let these words tell you why. Her handwriting was steady at first, then restless, lines slanting sharply as though fear had seeped into the ink. The letters described a relationship she was desperate to conceal, with a man of power and wealth, someone she could not escape. She never used his name, but the shadows she painted fit one man perfectly. He says I owe him, that I should be grateful for his attention. He watches me even when I'm not near him. I feel him everywhere. The notebooks carried similar fragments, snatches of thought written on layovers in hotel rooms, sometimes mid-flight, judging by the scribbled turbulence marks. One page had been underlined 3 times. If I tell the truth, I lose everything. If I stay silent, I lose myself. Detectives pieced the writings together, careful not to leap ahead. Was this paranoia or reality? The tone was intimate, the words bruised with exhaustion. She oscillated between longing and terror. One note read almost like a love letter. When he looks at me, it feels like falling. Another like a death sentence. If he finds out I'm writing this, it's over. Her roommate, brought in again for questioning, admitted she had once seen Elena tearing up a letter at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. She told me it was nothing, the roommate recalled, voice low. But I could tell it wasn't anything. It was eating her alive. The letters hinted at an ultimatum. Someone had pressed her into silence, threatening not just her job but something more. The words were vague, but the emotional weight was suffocating. One draft, dated just a week before her disappearance, chilled investigators most. He said we'd meet at the Evercrest. He said it's safer there, away from eyes that might see. I don't want to go, but I will because he won't take no. If I disappear, start here. The page ended abruptly, as though she had been interrupted. For detectives, the link was undeniable now. Her bag is inside the Evercrest. Her words pointed to a meeting there, and Halden's documented stay in the hotel that very night. 3 threads tightening into a noose. Still, the letters raised more questions than they answered. Was she writing them to protect herself? Or did she hope one day to expose the man haunting her? Why had she never sent them, fear or loyalty twisted into submission? The psychological portrait of Elena deepened. She was not reckless. She was deliberate, aware of danger and careful enough to leave a trail in ink. It suggested she knew something terrible could happen and she had tried, quietly, desperately, to prepare for the possibility. Detectives spread the papers across a table, photographs of Elena beside them. Her face in those photos was composed, professional. Her words, however, revealed fractures beneath the uniform. A woman standing on the edge of something she could not control. One detective whispered what everyone in the room felt. She was crying for help. And no one heard her. The chapter of her silence closed with that last note about the Evercrest. The case had always been a disappearance without answers. Now, it was a disappearance with a direction, straight into the walls of a hotel that refused to stay silent any longer. The Evercrest Hotel had once been called the Jewel of Midtown. Its marble staircases, Gilt chandeliers and velvet lounges had hosted heads of state, movie stars, and tycoons. In glossy brochures from the 1970s, it gleamed like a palace in the city skyline. By the early 1990s, however, Faircrest was fading. Competition from newer, cleaner hotels eroded its prestige. Its grand lobby grew quieter, its rooms less full. The clientele changed. Where once it had catered to royalty, it now served those who valued secrecy over luxury. Corporate elites meeting behind locked doors. Politicians conducting affairs. Deals whispered over late-night drinks in its dimly lit bar. Detectives in 2005 knew the building well by reputation. It was not simply a hotel. It was a shadow. A place where scandals were whispered but never proven. Where power was exercised behind curtains too thick for outsiders to pierce. Elena's letters had named it plainly. If I disappear, start here. And so they did. The demolition crew's find became evidence. The site, scheduled for destruction, transformed overnight into a crime scene. Police tape stretched across the cracked marble entry. Inside, investigators moved through dark hallways with flashlights. The beams cutting through dust and silence. The bag had been discovered in the east wing, its wall cavity freshly exposed by the crew's crowbar. Forensics combed the surrounding area, brushing plaster from the floor, scanning for traces that time might have preserved. They found nothing else, not yet. But the placement itself was suspicious. Someone had hidden her belongings deliberately. The detectives began pulling the hotel's old records. Ledgers showed Elena had checked in the night she vanished, but under a false name, Clara James. The handwriting matched hers, though shaky, as if written under duress. Why had she checked in at all? Was it voluntary, or had someone made her? Former employees were tracked down. Some had moved out of state, and others were reluctant to revisit their days at the Evercrest. One bartender, now retired, recalled the atmosphere of that era. Deals, secrets, that's what the place thrived on. You didn't ask questions if you wanted to keep your job. Another memory surfaced. A hostess remembered Elena's face. She had seen her once in March of '93, sitting in the lounge with a man in a tailored suit. The man was sharp-featured, commanding, his hand resting on the back of her chair in a way that felt more possessive than affectionate. Do you remember his name? Detectives pressed. The hostess shook her head. But when shown old photographs, her hand hesitated over one image. Richard Halden. The connection was tightening, but the Evercrest remained more than just a backdrop. The building itself bore witness, its walls layered with hidden stories. The police reports from the early 90s suggested that several women had filed complaints about harassment connected to the hotel. None against Halden directly, but always against men in power who stayed there. Almost all those cases had evaporated quietly. Settled, silenced, forgotten. For detectives, the Evercrest was no longer merely a location. It was a stage, and Elena's disappearance was only one act in a long play of corruption and secrecy. Still, they had no body. No proof of what had happened in those rooms. Only a bag, a false name, and words Elena had left behind. As investigators left the decayed corridors that night, one of them paused in the east wing, staring at the hole in the wall. The silence of the hotel pressed in, oppressive, like something unsaid. The Evercrest was not finished speaking. And when it did, it would speak in blood. The search for answers turned next to those who had known Elena best, her colleagues in the skies. Flight attendants are a fraternity of sorts, bonded by long hours, jet lag, and the peculiar intimacy of living thousands of feet above ground together. If Elena had cracked under pressure, someone would have noticed. Detectives tracked down 3 of her former coworkers from the March 18th Paris flight. They agreed to meet at a quiet bar near JFK, the same bar where crews had once gathered between assignments. Its low lighting and worn leather booths still carried the faint musk of spilled whiskey and jet fuel perfume. The women arrived cautiously, their uniforms long since traded for business attire, but the memories returned quickly once Elena's name was spoken. Marisa, who had shared shifts with Elena for nearly 2 years, leaned forward first. She was steady, professional, but that last month, she was different. Distracted, nervous. I remember once, mid-flight, she dropped a tray. She never dropped trays. And she cried. Right there in the galley. She said, "He won't let me go." The detectives pressed her. Who was he? Marisa shook her head. She never said. But the fear in her voice, it wasn't about a passenger. It was personal. Another attendant, Denise, added her memory. She recalled the night before Elena's disappearance. They'd gone for a drink after landing. Elena had ordered a glass of wine, unusual for her. Halfway through, her composure cracked. She said she was in over her head, that she'd made a mistake with a man she couldn't refuse. I asked if it was love. She laughed. God, that laugh, it was bitter. Love? She said. It's not love. It's control. The third attendant, quiet until now, finally spoke. Her name was Angela. She described a moment in the crew lounge at JFK just days before Elena vanished. Elena had been scribbling furiously in a notebook. When Angela asked what she was writing, Elena slammed it shut. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "If anything happens to me, don't believe the story they tell." I thought she was being dramatic. Now, I'm not so sure. The bar grew heavier with each confession. The detectives scribbled notes, but what mattered more was tone. The way each woman's voice faltered when speaking Elena's words aloud. It was as though her fear had passed to them, lingering 12 years later. The women ordered another round, and with it came one final story. Denise remembered Elena's last night out with them. She had broken down completely, face in her hands, whispering over and over, "He'll destroy me if I ever talk." Do you think she was talking about Richard Halden? One detective asked, laying the name on the table like a test. The women exchanged glances. No one answered directly, but the silence spoke louder than denial. The detectives left the bar with more than testimony. They left with the image of a woman unraveling, pulled into something she couldn't escape. Betrayal, manipulation, and fear had marked her final weeks, and her colleagues had been helpless witnesses. Back in the present, outside the bar, the night air carried the roar of departing planes. One detective lit a cigarette, staring into the runway lights. If she was meeting him that night, he muttered, smoke curling in the dark. The Evercrest isn't just a coincidence. It's the center of this whole damn thing. The case, once a mystery, was now orbiting a single point. The hotel, and the man she may have met there. Every investigation into betrayal carries a silent victim, the one left in the shadow of the affair. For Richard Halden, that shadow was his wife, Catherine. She lived in a mansion of glass and silence on the north shore of Long Island, the kind of estate where everything gleamed except the marriage inside. Detectives approached her cautiously. The tabloids had painted her as a wronged woman, but bitterness has its own sharp edges. When Catherine opened the door, she was immaculate. A pearl necklace at her throat, hair pinned in a style too precise to be casual. Her smile was polite, but her eyes burned with years of humiliation. "You're not the first to come asking," she said, ushering them inside. "But you might be the first who actually listens." They sat in a living room where nothing was out of place except the air itself. It pulsed with resentment. Catherine didn't waste time. "Of course I knew," she began, voice steady. "Richard wasn't subtle. The late nights, the missing weekends, the smell of perfume that wasn't mine. Elena was just one of many. But she was different. She made him reckless." The detectives leaned in. "Reckless how?" Catherine's laugh was brittle. "He called her his escape. Can you imagine? A man with everything, money, power, a home, and he risked it all for a flight attendant. That wasn't about lust. That was about control. He needed someone to remind him he still had power over a life he could bend, shape, destroy at will." Her words dripped with venom, but behind them lay something more. Fear. Catherine admitted she had once confronted Elena. It was late evening outside a Manhattan restaurant where she knew they'd meet. Catherine waited by the curb, a storm bottled in her chest. I walked right up to her. I told her, "You think you're special? You're not. You're replaceable just like the rest." She didn't argue. She just looked at me with pity. Pity that cut deeper than any insult. She said, "You should be careful. He'll turn on you too." The detectives pressed for details. Had Catherine ever threatened Elena? She shook her head, but her silence before answering lingered too long. Finally, she whispered, "Threaten? No, but did I want her gone? Absolutely. She was a stain on my life, on my family's name. And when she disappeared, a part of me felt relief. Isn't that terrible? Relief that she was no longer haunting my marriage." The room stilled. Her confession was raw, but it didn't smell of guilt. It smelled of old wounds festering in silence. One detective asked the question directly. "Do you believe Richard had something to do with Elena's disappearance?" Catherine's eyes hardened. "Believe? I know. He's a man who cleans up messes before anyone notices the spill. If Elena threatened to expose him, he would have silenced her. That's who Richard is. Charming in public, ruthless in private. I married a mask. Elena fell in love with a predator." The interview ended with Catherine standing at her window watching the detectives leave. She looked like a woman trapped in her own house, imprisoned not by walls but by the memory of a man who destroyed everything he touched. Back in their car, the detectives compared notes. Catherine's testimony didn't prove Richard's guilt, but it confirmed something undeniable. Elena wasn't just a flight attendant who disappeared. She was the fulcrum of a triangle sharpened by lust, jealousy, and power. The Evercrest loomed larger than ever. But now the case carried another weight. The fury of a wife who had lived in silence while another woman carried her husband's secret. And fury, they knew, could be just as dangerous as love. The Evercrest was still speaking, even 12 years after it had been abandoned. When detectives returned to catalog what remained, they found more than dust and silence. Hidden in the false back of a dresser drawer on the hotel's top floor was a small leather-bound book. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed, and the initials EM were scrawled in neat, looping handwriting. Elena Morales' diary. For the first time, her voice returned. Not through rumors, not through the whispers of others, but through her own words. The first entries were routine, notes on layovers, long flights, her love for the ocean, and the loneliness of hotel rooms that all smelled the same. But the tone shifted midway through the book. The writing turned jagged, hurried, as though she had written in hiding, terrified of being discovered. One entry read, "He says I'm his freedom, his escape. But freedom shouldn't feel like chains. I feel watched even when I'm alone. I can't tell if it's paranoia or if he's really everywhere. His wife knows. She looked at me once with eyes like knives. I don't know which of them I should fear more." The detectives exchanged a glance. This wasn't just infidelity, it was obsession. Another entry followed days later, darker still. He promised to leave her. He swore I'd never have to live in the shadows. But tonight he was different, angry, said I was pushing him, said I didn't understand how dangerous it was for him to be seen with me. I've never seen that look before. Like he was deciding something. Like I was already gone. The room chilled as the words were read aloud. The handwriting dipped and slanted near the edges of the page, as if Elena had written quickly under pressure, her hand shaking. Near the back of the diary, one unfinished entry stopped mid-sentence. If something happens to me, nothing followed. Just a deep indentation. The pen pressed hard into paper before stopping. Detectives stared at the unfinished line. Was she interrupted? Was someone with her when she tried to write her last thought? The diary ended there as if frozen in time. The discovery changed everything. The bag had been evidence of her presence. The diary was evidence of her fear. Together, they painted a picture far more sinister than a woman who simply ran away. One detective closed the book slowly, as though afraid to break what was left of her silence. She knew, he whispered. She knew the storm was coming. The question now was who delivered it. Richard? His wife Catherine is burning with humiliation? Or someone else entirely? Someone yet to be revealed in the shadows of the Evercrest? The press soon caught wind of the diary, and the headline screamed, "Flight Attendant's Last Words." For the public, it became another mystery to consume. But for investigators, it was a map with missing roads. The last entry suggested Elena had been preparing for the end. She anticipated danger, but not escape. At night, one detective returned alone to the Evercrest. He walked the corridors where the wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, the air stale and damp. He carried the diary in his hand, imagining Elena moving through these halls, pen trembling, heart racing. Trapped between love and terror, in that silence, he whispered aloud the unfinished line, "If something happens to me," as though saying it would summon the missing truth. But the walls gave nothing back. The Evercrest still held its secrets. And the diary's last wordless plea led them deeper, not to closure, but to the beginning of something far darker. By the time detectives traced the diary and the bag to the Evercrest, The investigation had transformed from a cold case into a high-stakes pursuit. But uncovering the truth was more complicated than they had imagined. Richard Halden was no ordinary suspect. His wealth and influence had grown exponentially over the 12 years since Elena vanished. His corporate empire spread through real estate, finance, and media holdings, connecting him to politicians and regulators. In short, Halden had become untouchable. Investigators quickly learned that attempts to retrieve old records were met with obstacles. Files had been misplaced, surveillance footage erased, and employees who might have remembered Elena were long gone or unwilling to speak. Even the original police report seemed watered down, as if someone had preemptively cleaned them. It became clear someone powerful had ensured Elena Morales' disappearance left as few traces as possible. The detectives interviewed former city officials who had served in 1993. Many had retired. Some refused comment, and a few whispered truths in hushed tones. One former records clerk confessed they didn't want the case public. Money changed hands. Influence shifted. It wasn't just Halden. It was everyone around him who had something to lose. The diary and letters now held weight beyond personal testimony. They were fragments of the truth, the only parts of Elena that had survived deliberate erasure. But the more investigators uncovered, the more they realized the scope of obstruction. It wasn't only Halden. Investigators found evidence suggesting city regulators, police officers, and even journalists had been pressured to look away. Each connection was a thread in a network designed to silence. Every piece of paper and memory from 1993 was filtered, lost, or manipulated. The frustration weighed heavily. One detective sat in the hotel's dark lobby, tracing the cracks in the marble floor with a flashlight, and murmured, "The richer they get, the more invisible they become." The diary's warnings took on new meaning. Elena's fear of Richard's power, of his reach, wasn't paranoia. It was precise foresight. She had known that her disappearance wouldn't just depend on a single person. It would require complicity, protection, and silence from the world around him. Even as investigators traced her steps in 2005, they faced resistance at every turn. Freedom of information requests were delayed, surveillance logs missing, and witnesses intimidated into silence. Each attempt to illuminate the past only revealed the depth of the influence Halden wielded. And yet, the team persisted. They cross-referenced Elena's diary entries with hotel records, airline manifests, and employee testimony. Each detail pointed toward the same conclusion. The Evercrest was not merely a setting, it had been an instrument. The hotel had hosted the private conflicts, the meetings, and the arguments that would eventually culminate in Elena's disappearance. The stark reality settled over them like fog. Uncovering the truth would not only require evidence of what happened that night, it would require dismantling a carefully constructed shield of wealth, privilege, and fear. As night fell over the city, the detectives left the Evercrest, its shadows long and oppressive. The building had seen 12 years of silence, but even silence had limits. The diary, the letters, the bag, they were all breaking through that silence, peeling away the layers of protection that had shielded Halden. Somewhere inside, a part of Elena's story still lingered, waiting for the right witness to step forward. The investigation was no longer about merely finding a missing woman. It was about confronting the invisible power that had allowed her to vanish. The stage was set. The silence that had swallowed 12 years was about to be pierced. For 12 years, the Evercrest Hotel had kept its secrets locked behind peeling wallpaper and dust-laden floors. Now a former maintenance worker stepped forward. He had been silent all these years, terrified of speaking. But the discovery of Elena's bag and diary had awakened memories he could no longer bury. He remembered the night clearly. March 18th, 1993. He was on the top floor, performing routine checks of the heating ducts. It was late, the halls empty, the air thick with the faint scent of mildew and furniture polish. Then he heard it, shouting, sharp and desperate, echoing down the hallway. He froze, listening. Two voices, one male, low and dangerous, the other female, high-pitched and trembling but resolute. He recognized the power in the male voice immediately, even through the years. Commanding, precise, unyielding. Richard Halden realized with a chill that lasted a decade. And I said no. Elena's voice cut through the air, sharp and desperate. I will not be part of this. Do you think you have a choice? Halden's reply was smooth, almost cold. "You're mine tonight, and you'll do as I say." The worker's hands shook as he recalled stepping closer and pressing against the wall for cover. He had seen them through a narrow crack in a service door. Elena was fighting, her fists raised, knocking him back when he tried to grab her wrist. The man grabbed her with a terrifying grip, slamming her into the corner of a table. Glass shattered. "Wine spilled, I told you!" Elena screamed, her voice breaking, raw with rage and fear. "I will not be silent." It was the last sound he remembered clearly. The rest was a blur. A struggle, shadows, movement too quick to track. Then silence fell like a lid over the room. The worker stayed hidden until morning, terrified of the consequences if anyone discovered he had witnessed the confrontation. By the time he ventured out, the hallway was empty. Elena gone. The hotel quiet as if she had never been there. When detectives pressed him for details in 2005, he showed them the exact floor, the room, and even the spot where the struggle had occurred. His recollection matched the placement of Elena's bag, now discovered hidden behind a false wall near the service entrance. It confirmed the sequence of events that had long been suspected but never proven. She had been brought here against her will, had resisted fiercely, and had left her belongings behind in a desperate attempt to preserve a trace of herself. Her fight, though heroic, had not saved her, but it had left a mark, evidence that spoke louder than words. Broken glass, blood traces preserved under decades of dust, and the bag sealed into the wall. It wasn't just fear, the worker said softly. It was courage. She tried to take control, even at the last moment. The detectives left the Evercrest that night with more than just evidence. They left with a vision of Elena alive, defiant, and unbowed. The narrative of her disappearance shifted. No longer was she merely a passive victim. She was a woman who resisted, who tried to reclaim her agency in the face of overwhelming power. Yet the revelation brought its own burden. If Halden had orchestrated this, then justice remained elusive. He had vanished into wealth, influence, and connections that shielded him from accountability. The Evercrest Hotel, silent for 12 years, had finally testified. Elena's courage, her defiance, and her struggle were recorded not in headlines, but in the walls themselves. As detectives stepped into the night, the Evercrest loomed behind them, dark and oppressive, whispering of secrets still waiting to be uncovered. And in that shadow, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to click into place. The investigation had stretched over 12 years, from the day Elena Morales vanished to the discovery of her bag behind the walls of the Evercrest Hotel. Now, after months of painstaking work, detectives finally pieced together a narrative that had been hidden beneath silence. Fear and wealth, Elena's diary, letters, and eyewitness testimony painted a clear picture. She had been targeted, manipulated, and cornered by a man who believed his power placed him above consequences. Richard Halden had taken advantage of a system designed to protect the influential, leaving Elena's life suspended in uncertainty. Yet the diary and the bag were not merely remnants, they were a testament. They revealed her defiance, her courage, and her unwillingness to surrender quietly, even in the face of impossible odds she had fought. Her struggle, previously invisible, was now impossible to ignore. Detectives cross-referenced the diary entries with hotel maintenance logs, interviews with former staff, and Halden's own movements. The night she disappeared, she had attempted to escape his grip. In the chaos, she left behind the evidence that would later expose the depth of his control. Catherine Halden's testimony added another dimension: betrayal and jealousy, tempered with fear and rage. The wife, though complicit through silence, had unknowingly preserved Elena's warnings. Her bitterness confirmed the toxicity of the triangle that had engulfed Elena in her final days. The physical evidence, the bag, the glass shards, faint blood traces, and the hidden letters, aligned with witness accounts. Together, they constructed an irrefutable timeline. Elena had been lured to the Evercrest, resisted, and in the confrontation, vanished. The hotel had held the truth for over a decade, like a tomb preserving the memory of her fight. But even with proof, justice remained incomplete. Halden's empire shielded him from legal consequences. Years of influence, money, and connections ensured that no indictment would follow. Detectives realized that truth and justice were no longer synonymous. One could illuminate the darkness without ever delivering punishment. Still, revealing the story was itself a form of justice. Through the press, through the diary's publication, and through the testimony of those who remembered her, Elena's life could no longer be erased. She was no longer a name on a missing persons flyer. She was a woman who had fought, who had resisted, and whose courage resonated across time. Her mother, now aged with decades of grief, wept quietly when shown the recovered bag, the diary, and letters. She was brave, she whispered. She tried to tell us everything. And finally, we know. In the empty halls of the Evercrest, detectives performed a final walkthrough. Dust hung in shafts of light like fragile memories. The hotel, silent for years, had revealed its testimony. Its walls held both horror and resilience, the story of a young woman whose life had been threatened but whose spirit refused to vanish. Though the world could never undo the years of suffering or erase the manipulation she endured, Elena's voice survived. And for the detectives, for her family, and for those who had witnessed her courage, that survival was profound. Outside, the city moved on. Skyscrapers gleamed, taxis honked, planes lifted into the sky. Yet somewhere in the quiet corners of memory and in the walls of the Evercrest, Elena Morales remained, not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as a testament to resistance, to courage, and to the unbreakable human spirit. Her disappearance was never fully punished, but her story, finally unearthed, was undeniable. The truth had been buried, but truth, like dust in sunlight, eventually finds a way to shine.